Okay, guys, we'll start the live stream very shortly. Just sit tight. All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start the live stream right now. I'll turn off the music. Remember, if you have any questions, whether they're related to the items on the study guide that are listed on the left-hand side, or if you have specific questions about the essay, please go ahead and write them in the Google Doc for the live stream. Couple of things I wanted to make sure you guys knew. I have updated the study guide to include a couple of things. First and foremost, to include 3 additions that we didn't get a chance to talk about before the Chapter 5 through 7 test, but these are 3 things that you guys need to be familiar with, and they will be showing up on the multiple choice section of the Unit 1 test, even though they are outside of Chapters 8 and 9, and those are listed at the top. This is also updated on the study guide portion on the web page, so if you see the study guide that's posted up now on the web page, you'll see that what you see on the left side of the screen is exactly the same. So that's the first thing. As you can see, we've got a much smaller list than before. You're only going to have 20 multiple choice questions for this particular test. And that's because, as I mentioned in class, we're going to devote most of our time to writing the Unit 1 essay. So the way that we're going to do this is we'll go over the multiple choice section first, and then oh, excuse me. Woo. And then I will go over some suggestions for the essay. Now, if you were in first, third, or fifth period, we've already spent some time on outlining the essay. If you have second period, and I will see you tomorrow, we're going to be spending time in class outlining the essay as well as going over the 2 remaining pieces of the long essay, the supporting paragraphs and the conclusion. So, we're going to go ahead and get started with the multiple choice, the study guide on the left-hand side there. Remember, if you have questions, please type them into the Google Doc, and I will answer them at the end of my comments on both the multiple choice and the essay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with the XYZ affair. So the XYZ affair, you have to understand, fell under John Adams' presidency, and remember that John Adams, like Jefferson, like James Madison, and of course like George Washington, is dealing with the issue of keeping the United States neutral in the war that is between France and Britain that came out of the French Revolution. We actually ended up fighting for a time an undeclared naval war with France. It's known as the Quasi-War, and it's what leads to the XYZ affair. Essentially, John Adams sent over an American delegation to Paris to negotiate with the Jacobin government that was under Robespierre at the time. And he wanted to negotiate a treaty treaty. He did not want to fight alongside the French or the British in the war that they were fighting against each other. And the story goes is that the American delegation was met by 3 agents of the French ambassador, who later became known as X, Y, and Z. And what they tried to do is they tried to extort money out of the United States in exchange for a peace treaty. They basically said, well, you know, if you want to sign a peace treaty with our government, that's going to cost you at the very least $250,000. And at that time, in the 1790s, that's a lot of money. So, of course, the American delegation left, and they came back to the United States, and, you know, they reported back to Congress, and many members of Congress were clamoring for war with France because our national honor had been insulted. And in one of John Adams' great moments as president, he urged calm, and he said, look, we're going to send another delegation back to Paris. If we're met with the same disdain, then we'll move forward with the declaration of war. But maybe we were just talking to the wrong people. So he sends the second American delegation back to France, and in the time that the initial delegation showed up, or back home, and then the second delegation left, Robespierre has been kicked out of power. And now Napoleon's in power, and Napoleon doesn't want, to fight a war with the United States. He's got enough on his hands already. And so they're able to sign a treaty. So the XYZ affair shows how John Adams was able to maintain neutrality in the war between France and Britain. The Alien and the Sedition Acts were also part of John Adams' presidency, which is the next item. These were very controversial because, as I mentioned, his primary goal in his presidency is to keep the United States neutral. And there were a number of people coming over from France and England trying to rile up American support for either side. And John Adams pushed through Congress two very controversial pieces of legislation that eventually cost him a second term as president. And he did that knowing full well that it would. The Alien Act basically said that the President of the United States could remove or kick out any foreign national that he or she deemed as a threat to the security of the United States, which meant it gave John Adams, as president, some pretty broad executive power. The Sedition Acts were, without a doubt, the least unpopular between the two. And that's because the Sedition Acts basically said that if you were to write overly critical or, I believe the words were slanderous material about the president or the government and their kind of motions to keep the United States neutral in this war between Britain and France, that they could throw you in jail. And in fact, Adams ended up throwing in jail over 20 Democratic Republicans for them being so outspoken against his actions in trying to maintain neutrality. Now, this is, as I mentioned to you guys, one example of when, in times of war, sometimes our civil liberties tend to get put away in a drawer for a time, or they're explained away with the answer, well, it's during wartime and we're trying to protect the country, so we have to give up some of our civil liberties to protect the country. And the response from the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, became known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now, you have to understand, these aren't laws, but what comes out of them is a very important term that is used, and later is one that is very tied to the coming Civil War. And so the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions came out of two meetings, and they basically made a proclamation, even though it had no legal standing and no power behind it. The Democratic Republicans said that, and this is the key term to know, that states had the right to nullify or cancel any federal law that it deemed as unconstitutional. Now, this isn't a power that state governments had, but from those meetings they came out with this term nullification, which is the state's supposed power to be able to nullify a federal law that it felt was unconstitutional. Now again, this is something that doesn't work under the Constitution because we know the federal government has supremacy. But what it does show is a couple things. Number one, the term nullification is going to come up quite a lot in the coming chapters, particularly with Andrew Jackson's presidency. But it also shows that this is a constant debate that we have throughout American history about wartime, and whether or not American civil liberties should be sacrificed in the name of security. So those three terms, although they came from Chapter 7, they are going to show up on the test. Next, we have Jefferson's presidency, and we're going to be going over some of the specifics. But there's a couple of key points. Number one, Thomas Jefferson oversaw the first major expansion of U.S. territory with the Louisiana Purchase. Secondly, he, like John Adams, as well as George Washington, is continuing to try to keep the United States neutral in the war between Britain and France. And lastly, Jefferson's presidency is significant because when he took office in 1800, it was the peaceful transfer of power from one party to the other. The Federalists gave up power willingly without any bloodshed and gave it to the Democratic Republicans. So those are some key general points about Jefferson's presidency. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty here in a second. Madison's presidency, you have to understand the foreign policy was the primary focus of Madison's presidency. He was the President of the United States during the War of 1812 when the United States was invaded by Great Britain. He was the President of the United States who was evacuated and later tried to rally troops after the loss at Bladensburg, and then what happened after that is basically parts of Washington, D.C. were burnt to the ground by British troops. So Madison's presidency is centered again on foreign policy, and in his case, they were not able to maintain neutrality, and we'll talk about why that happened in the War of 1812 coming up. Henry Clay, we talked about him today in class, and for you folks in second period, more on Henry Clay tomorrow. But Henry Clay is an American politician and a statesman who is the author of a number of compromises and pieces of legislation that really occur from the early 1820s all the way through the 1850s. You are going to see his name pop up quite a lot. And typically it comes around compromise, and that is the compromise between free and slave states, which we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. Next, we have Lewis and Clark's expedition. This was, of course, the group, or the two officers who led a group into the Louisiana Purchase in search of what Thomas Jefferson and others called the Northwest Passage, which is an all-water route to the Pacific Ocean. You can understand why that was something the United States was interested in, because of the obvious economic gain and possible trade, down the road with Asia. But one thing you have to know about the Lewis and Clark expedition is obviously all the individuals that went on that, very long walk between St. Louis and Seattle and back should be commended for their bravery and for their courage. But it's likely that they wouldn't have made it as far as they did without the contribution of Sacagawea, the Native American woman who accompanied them on most of the journey. Mainly because she ended up convincing many Native American tribes that the predominantly white party was not a threat to them. Let's see. Next we have impressment. So this is the primary cause of the War of 1812. Impressment refers to the practice that was done by the British Navy, where British warships would stop American merchant ships who were just trading on the high seas and basically force them at gunpoint to serve in the British Navy. Britain was obviously fighting for its, certainly its power, to a certain extent its life, against Napoleon. And while they had plenty of ships, they did not have the amount of sailors that they wanted to have in their navy. Now, the practice of impressment, and there were American sailors who were forced against their will to basically join the military of another country, which is a huge violation of international rights and also individual rights. But what's significant about impressment is that this is the primary cause, or at least it's been identified as the primary cause of the War of 1812. But by the time the British we had declared war, and the British had invaded a year and a half or so after that point, they had stopped the policy of impressment. Napoleon had been defeated, at least for the first time. So it's rather strange, the War of 1812, and we'll be talking about that here momentarily. Next, you have John Marshall's Supreme Court. You need to know that John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for over 34 years. He was a Federalist. In class, we talked about how his experience as a Revolutionary War veteran, as a member of Congress and a member of the Virginia legislature, as well as a witness to the French Revolution, may have impacted his decision-making. You guys did a great job with that. It was a fun conversation. But remember, Marshall's Supreme Court is significant because it lays the foundation for the powers that the Supreme Court has. And especially after the Hartford Convention, which we'll talk about here momentarily, John Marshall is one of the few Federalists that still holds a position of power in the government after the War of 1812. Now, the 4 court cases that are listed below were originally not on the study guide, and I'm not sure how I missed that. But regardless, I've remedied that. You should have these. The graphic organizers already filled out for these court cases. For those of you who were on the English field trip, I'm going to be posting the key to those court cases in Google Classroom here after the live stream, and you can certainly ask, friends or acquaintances that you have in any of the sections of AP US History to get the ones that you missed out when you guys had to leave early for the English field trip. So we're going to start with Gibbons versus Ogden, and then we're going to skip Marbury versus Madison for a moment and go to McCulloch versus Maryland, because both Gibbons versus Ogden and McCulloch versus Maryland are very similar court cases, because both of them are about establishing federal supremacy over the states. In the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, You have the state of New York, who wishes to deny a person who has a federal license the right to operate a ferry, stating that they don't have a state license, so therefore they can't operate a ferry service. This is, of course, a violation of, the supremacy, kind of, compass that the Constitution has, where a federal license will always outweigh or cancel out a state license. And in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, what you have is the state of Maryland tried to tax the national bank in Maryland, which essentially is a state trying to tax the federal government. And it doesn't work that way. Okay, the federal government always has supremacy. And these two court cases were found in favor of that notion that the federal government does have supremacy over the states. And it's no surprise because John Marshall himself was a Federalist. The next court case below that, Dartmouth versus Woodward, this is an important court case because it upheld the sanctity of contracts. In other words, if you have a contract, it means that it's binding. State of New Hampshire tried to make Dartmouth College, which was founded under the British Empire, a state college rather than a private college, and Dartmouth was like, no, we already have this charter that we signed with England. And the state's like, yeah, but that was, under the British Empire, now we're the United States. But Marshall and his court ruled in favor of Dartmouth, saying, look, they had a written contract. But of all these court cases that you need to know, the most important, in my mind, certainly in American history, is Marbury versus Madison, mainly because it gave the court what we now know as judicial review. It basically made the Supreme Court of the United States the referee of the Constitution. If you look at the original language of the Constitution prior to 1803, when Marbury versus Madison occurred, the Supreme Court doesn't really have the power that it has after Marbury versus Madison. If you remember the word cloud that we did in class, we definitely saw lots of mentions of the executive and lots of mentions of Congress and the legislative branch, but the judicial branch is barely mentioned. And why John Marshall's Supreme Court was so influential is because they gave the Supreme Court the power that we all recognize that it has now, which is to either affirm or to strike down any law, whether it be a state law or a federal law or an executive order by a president, as unconstitutional. So that court case made the Supreme Court a very powerful branch of our federal government. And Marbury versus Madison, remember, that's the one that everyone needs to remember. It is without a doubt the most important, and I guarantee you it's going to show up on the test. Next we have James Monroe's presidency. A couple things. Remember, he's associated with the era of good feelings, and for you second period folks, we'll talk more about that tomorrow in class. And that's essentially, one-party rule in the United States after the disaster of the Federalists at the Hartford Convention. We also need to know that James Monroe is the last of the Founding Fathers generation, the Revolutionary generation, who assumes power. Everybody after that point will be the children, essentially, of the generation that fought the American Revolution. So he's the last of those first Founding Fathers. And then, of course, Monroe's presidency is associated with a couple of major pieces of first legislation with the Missouri Compromise, but also with a major kind of staple in American foreign policy, which is the Monroe Doctrine, which we'll talk about here momentarily. Next we have Tecumseh, and we haven't gotten a chance to talk about Tecumseh yet in class. We are going to be talking about him as well as other Native American leaders during the early stages of the Republic when we start Unit 2, specifically after we talk about Andrew Jackson's presidency. But what you need to know about Tecumseh is a couple of things. First off, he is a Native American chief. He's a Shawnee, and why he's significant is because he's one of the first attempts by a Native American to unite tribes across, in this case, Ohio and Indiana, and really the country, against white settlement. And it was one of the largest attempts to kind of resist white settlement, certainly in the early 19th century. And Tecumseh, that's his goal, is that he wants to create a unified Native American confederacy to act as a check to the westward expansion that's happening already in the early 1800s. So that's what you need to know about Tecumseh. You need to know that he aligned himself with the British during the War of 1812 because he felt that the only way that the Confederacy or the alliance that he had created would survive was with British help. But he was eventually defeated during the War of 1812 at the Battle of the Thames River and killed. And we're going to be talking about Tecumseh's contribution to American history and the significance of that, as I said, when we start Unit 2. But those are the basics that you need to know about Tecumseh. Next, we have the Louisiana Purchase. This is something we did spend some time on in class. Remember that Thomas Jefferson may have, at least in his own eyes, abused his executive power by agreeing to purchase the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for 3 times that of the federal budget for that year, $15 million. Now, in exchange for that $15 million payment that Napoleon was saving for his invasion of Great Britain, which never happened, the United States was able to benefit greatly from that. I mean, we doubled the size of the country, for one. We were able to add the very busy economic center and port in New Orleans. And the main one was that in addition to the natural resources that we were able to gain in that area, we gained control of the Mississippi River, which was a natural highway and a natural conduit for trade and economic exchange. So it was a big win for the United States. But many people thought that, you know what, it might be something that looks too good to be true, especially Alexander Hamilton, who said, yeah, you know, the land's great. And, you know, he had some weak reasons, you know, for opposing it. He just hated Jefferson, which is really the reason he opposed it. But the one thing that Hamilton brought up, or actually 2 that he brought up as being potential issues, is number 1, that land is not inhabited. There are hundreds of Native American tribes that have lived there for centuries, which means now the United States government is going to have a policy around how are Americans going to be interacting with Native Americans. Is it going to be a live and let live situation? Is the government going to encourage the Native American tribes to assimilate or adapt to American culture? Or is it just going to be a war of conquest? So that's the first thing Hamilton brings up. And the second thing he brings up is the big one. He said, look, you know, if you add all this land, you know, who's going to determine whether the states as they get added are free or slave? That's going to be a problem. And it's going to lead you to a place where really no one wants to go, and that is to discuss, at that point in history, the very controversial topic of slavery. And when the Louisiana Purchase happens, it guarantees the Civil War is going to be fought that century. Guarantees it. So that's what you need to know about that. 1803 as well. The Embargo and Non-Intercourse Act happened over Jefferson and Madison's presidency. This is when the United States, again, was trying to remain neutral in the war between Great Britain and France. And they opted to really solidify American neutrality by basically not trading with Europe and then not trading with France or England. Now that worked to a point. I mean, it tanked the British economy, put a real dent in the French economy, but it also tanked the American economy too, because at that point we were very dependent on trade with Europe, especially with our top 2 trading partners, the British and the French. So that's what the Embargo and Non-Intercourse Acts are. They, again, across 2 presidencies, Jefferson and then Madison's. Next, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We talked about this in class, so second period, stay tuned for news. But the Monroe Doctrine, first off, you have to understand, other than it occurred and was given during Monroe's presidency in 1823, it's not a law. It's not a law. It's not a piece of legislation that's gone through Congress. It's not even an executive order that Monroe issued. It's simply a speech, where in the speech Monroe basically says, "Look, all of these countries that have become independent republics, like the United States in Central and South America, will be protected by the U.S. We will make sure that the European colonizers don't come back to try and retake that land." Now, while that sounds great and is a very nice gesture on the behalf of the United States, who was one of the first republics in the Western Hemisphere, there's some problems with it. Number one, in 1823, we had no way of enforcing that. Our Army and Navy were nowhere near the size it is now, and certainly not that powerful at the time. And secondly, what the Monroe Doctrine becomes is a staple, for good or bad, of American foreign policy. Later, Teddy Roosevelt adds what's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which says, yes, we're going to protect all the countries in the Western Hemisphere from European colonization, but we also reserve the right to intervene in their affairs. So every major foreign policy action the United States has had since 1823 can be traced back to the belief that's really set forth in the Monroe Doctrine that says, yeah, we can kind of do what we want, when we want, and how we want as a country. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. Let's see, moving down. The American system. This is another idea from Henry Clay. The primary purpose of the American system was to make the United States less dependent on European trade, because up until that point, the American economy was not thriving, and it was largely because it was import heavy. And our economy was basically acting like the economy of a colony rather than an independent country. So the American system had three parts to it, two of which, as I mentioned in class today, are pretty sound, economic measures. The last one being one that is, usually leads to disaster. So the first recommendation that Clay makes, he's like, look, we need to build up American industry so we don't rely on imports from other countries. We want to make our own goods so we can, A, purchase them in our own country, but also sell them, to other countries. So this is kind of laying the seeds for the beginning of what's known as the market revolution that eventually blows up into the Industrial Revolution. So that's point one for the American system. That is, to make goods in the United States. Point two, set up a second national bank to basically give out loans specifically to stimulate business investment. And what we see at this point, are the American infrastructure is starting to be built up. We built the National Road, the Erie Canal. Settlements are popping up around rivers because those are natural highways. And this is all before the railroad really becomes a thing. So the American system, again, is laying the foundation for the beginnings of the market revolution, which ends up turning into the Industrial Revolution. But the big flaw in the American system was the protective tariff or tax that they put on foreign goods. 22%. It's a huge tax rate. Now the idea is that you force the American consumer to look at two products, both of them are the same, one made in America, one that's made, say, in France, but the price between them is so different. The American one's so much cheaper, and the French one is 22% higher in cost. That would force Americans or suggest Americans to Americans, hey, buy this product because it's cheaper. It's made in the United States. Now that makes sense. But when other countries that you trade with hear that you're putting on a tax on their goods, what do you think they're going to do to your goods that you sell in their country? They're going to do the exact same thing. And we actually see this playing out right now. There are tariffs that have been put in place on products coming into the U.S., most notably steel. And one of our biggest trading partners, China, has already basically said, hey, if you guys put these tariffs on the stuff that we send to your country, we're going to kind of reciprocate. And that was the great failure of the American system, is that it halted American trade because of this tariff. So that's what the American system is, another kind of development of Henry Clay's very brilliant mind. Next, we have early industrial growth in the 19th century. I mean, as I mentioned, you have infrastructure being built up, whether it be roads, like the National Road. You have the Erie Canal and other canals built up. I mentioned earlier, settlement around rivers as natural highways. We also see a change, in where Americans are working. The single-family farm is kind of like the most common profession during the 18th century. But we see that start to change in the 19th century because one of the hardest things in the world to do is to be a farmer. Because there's no guarantee that the crops that you grow, A, are going to grow, or B, that you're going to sell them for a profit. And so many Americans opted to do a more modern take, which would be go into the cities, work in a factory, do a job, and then guaranteed every day or every week get paid for that job. So the early industrial growth that happened in the 19th century is we see a shift from work on the American farm in the American factory. And we see examples of this set up like in Lowell, Massachusetts. But this is only the beginnings. It's known as the market revolution, is that we're starting to become a country that produces our own goods, and that eventually that market revolution, once the railroad is introduced, blows up into a full-on industrial revolution, which we'll be talking about in the coming weeks in class. So those are the factors you need to know about early industrial growth in the 19th century. The era of good feelings is related to the one that's the term that's just below it, the Hartford Convention. And so I'll start with the Hartford Convention, then I'll talk about the era of good feelings. So the Hartford Convention was a meeting that was held during the War of 1812 by the Federalists, some Federalists in New England who were not exactly thrilled with the idea of the War of 1812 because they had lost out on so much money in the trade they were doing with Great Britain. And they were also very, I don't know, what's the word, tired of being under Democratic-Republican rule. They had been 8 years under Jefferson, almost 8 years under Madison. And they wanted to make some changes to the Constitution. And they suggested everything from like limiting presidential terms to one term for 4 years and that's it, amongst others. Now these suggestions might have been received differently, but unfortunately for the Federalists, they chose to release their findings or their demands from the Hartford Convention almost right after Andrew Jackson's great victory in the War of 1812 at the Battle of New Orleans, when the entire country was in a very patriotic mood. And so when the Federalists did this, against the backdrop of this huge triumph, it made them look weak, it made them look unpatriotic, and so in the following election, almost every Federalist was voted out of office. So the Hartford Convention destroyed the Federalist Party, and what then happened during Monroe's presidency is known as the era of good feelings. And this is when, really, there were no Federalists in power other than in the Supreme Court. And the Democratic Republicans controlled everything. They controlled the Senate, they controlled the House, they had the presidency. Hence, the era of good feelings, this notion that there's no political kind of clashing that's happening, or that we saw happen like under Jefferson and Hamilton's time. So that's the era of good feelings, and you have to know James Monroe's presidency is most associated with that. I mentioned the Battle of New Orleans. This was a huge American victory in the War of 1812. Oddly enough, it happened after the treaty that ended the War of 1812, which is the next term. The Treaty of Ghent was signed. And when they brought back the news that we had signed a treaty with Great Britain and the war was over, that's when most people were celebrating the great victory that happened in New Orleans, because news traveled pretty slow. Now, why the Battle of New Orleans is significant is because it made Andrew Jackson a national hero. And without his victory at the Battle of New Orleans, it's unlikely that Jackson would eventually become President of the United States. And his role as president is going to be one of the first major changes that we see in our system of government. Andrew Jackson is our next area of focus for next week after the test. So he's definitely, without a doubt, a very polarizing figure in American history. A lot of people think he is, without a doubt, a top 6 president, but a lot of people think he might be one of the worst presidents we've ever had. So I'm going to let you guys decide where you are on that spectrum next week. But remember, it did bring him to national prominence. We got 3 more. The Missouri Compromise. This is neat to know. Not just for this test, but for the AP test. You have to understand the Missouri Compromise is one example of how the United States government is trying to avoid the question of slavery. And essentially what happens is this. You have in 1819 a balance of 11 free and 11 slave states. Nobody wants to talk about slavery because it's such a controversial subject. Missouri is a territory, and in 1820 it basically wants to come into the Union, but it says we would like to come into the Union as a slave state. Now, that's a problem, because now you would have 12 slave states and 11 free states. Suddenly slavery is once again on the primary topic of discussion in Congress. There's even calls in some cases for breaking from the North already in the 1820s. But Henry Clay comes to the rescue and puts a Band-Aid on it, and it's nothing more than a Band-Aid. And the Missouri Compromise, you have to know 3 things about it. So first off, Missouri does come in as a slave state, but Maine comes in as a free state. So now you have an equal balance of 12 free and 12 slave states. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is that it sets up a dividing line. and the remaining Louisiana Territory, or Louisiana Purchase, that hasn't been organized yet. This dividing line is called the 36-30 line. And that dividing line basically sets a rule. And the third thing you need to know is the rule is that any territory below the line that wants to come in as a state will automatically be a slave state. Any territory above the line that wants to come in as a state will automatically be a free state. Now, the significance behind the Missouri Compromise is pretty big. Number one, this is a cause of the Civil War. And Henry Clay is actually 30 years later going to craft something very similar to prevent the Civil War from happening in 1850, but more on that later. But again, this kind of goes back to what Alexander Hamilton said about the Louisiana Purchase. He's like, it's going to cause problems. And sure enough, the Missouri Compromise is an example of how it brought slavery into the national conversation and almost split the country apart in 1820. And as you guys know, that's eventually going to happen in 1860 when the Civil War starts. So that's what you need to know about the Missouri Compromise. Lastly, the election of 1800. I mentioned this when we talked about Jefferson's presidency at the very beginning of the live stream. You need to understand that Jefferson, why that election is significant is because Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, took power from John Adams, the Federalist, without any bloodshed. It's also known as the Peaceful Revolution of 1800. And Jefferson's presidency, he wants to base it on really the rule of law. Like, he is what's called a strict constitutionalist, which is essentially someone who says, all right, the Constitution says you have to do A, B, and C. That's exactly what you do. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, is like, well, you know, it can be bent a little bit. So that's what you need to know about the election of 1800. And lastly, the very strange War of 1812. We talked about its cause, which was impressment. We talked about its significance, like the Battle of New Orleans, the rise to Andrew Jackson's prominence. But really, the War of 1812, you know, I don't know if I'd call it a win. It's definitely not a loss. It's slightly more than a tie. But why it's significant is that it reasserted America's kind of standing in the world, which basically said, look, like, this is the second time we went toe-to-toe with the British, and we basically forced them into a peace treaty again. So it reasserted America's, like, standing as a country. Okay, so if the one thing that came out of this very strange war where the capital was almost burnt down, and a thunderstorm actually put out much of the fire on September 11th of all dates, and then you have the national anthem that comes from the siege of Baltimore and Fort McKinley. It's a very strange war, but the significance, again, is that brought Andrew Jackson into the national eye, but also reasserted America's place as a country. Okay, so that's just the multiple choice. We're going to go ahead and shift now to some recommendations that I would like to make about the essay. This doesn't mean that, you know, these things I'm about to say doesn't mean you have to basically copy this. That's not how this works. I would encourage all of you to look at what your classes were able to come up with in the shared Google Slides presentation that we constructed today as you craft your own argument. Now, second period, again, I feel like a broken record. We are going to be doing this tomorrow morning, so that will all make sense as what that is. But that said, I'd like to give you some recommendations for the essay. And then I see we have at least one question here. If there are any other questions that pop up while I'm talking about the essay, feel free to write them. So let's go ahead and talk about the essay. So you guys know the prompt is basically asking you, it's saying, was the Constitution a true Hamiltonian document, and was the Articles of Confederation a true Jeffersonian document? So the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is what's on the right there in the white text box. And these are possible, specific historical evidence that you could use to prove your point. Remember, you need 6 historical facts within the time period and an additional 2 for your context point. So 1 before the time period and 1 after the time period. So those 2 charts that I gave you that we worked on in class, the differences between Jefferson and Hamilton's political ideology, as well as the structure and the characteristics of the Articles and the Constitution, those are absolute, things you should include in your essay, those pieces of information that are there, when it's relevant, of course. But where other sources or other things you can mention in your essay, you can talk about Shays' Rebellion and the role that it played in bringing the Constitution about. You can talk about the Whiskey Rebellion and talk about how that proved the Constitution worked because it was put down very quickly. You can mention Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers, the series of essays that he, James Madison, and John Jay wrote in support of the ratification of the Constitution. You can talk about the role of the Bill of Rights and Jefferson's insistence on making sure there were guaranteed rights for the people in the Constitution. You can mention the Constitutional Convention of 1787, anything that was discussed therein, everything from the gag rule to the Great Compromise, to the Three-Fifths Compromise, the branches of government, etc. You can talk about the ratification process of the Constitution when the Constitution went on tour, and then you had really, kind of rancorous and very heated debates like in the state of New York, which only ratified the Constitution by 3 votes. And you can also mention Washington and Adams presidencies and how their actions as the executive, aligned with what Jefferson and Hamilton believed in each of the documents that are asked. So that's where you can pull some information. This isn't necessarily the only thing. It's just some things to think about. So for the thesis, you're going to ask, remember, it's asking you to support, modify, or refute the contention that the Constitution is Hamiltonian and that the Articles of Confederation is Jeffersonian. So if you're going to answer yes to that, which many people are, this is what I'd recommend. First off, when you write your thesis statement, if you're saying yes, we definitely see Jefferson in the Articles and we definitely see Hamilton in the Constitution, the first thing you need to do is you need to be able to ask yourself, okay, these guys are definitely linked to their documents, but who has the stronger link? So if I think that, say, in this example I'm about to show you, that Hamilton has a much stronger link to the Constitution than Jefferson does to the Articles. Now I'm not disagreeing with the prompt. I'm saying yes, they are associated with those documents. But I would write my thesis something like this. I'd say, although there are many clear connections to Thomas Jefferson's political viewpoints seen in the Articles of Confederation, such as his belief in states' rights, comma, then you would say something like, it is clear that the Constitution, without a doubt, is a Hamiltonian document as seen in his belief and the creation of the strong centralized government in the Constitution. So if I were to say that the Constitution and the Articles are both linked to these guys, but the Constitution has a stronger link, here's how I would set up my outline. First thing in my intro, other than my thesis, I would talk about the context before 1777. What's happening, or what has happened that led the United States to look for its own form of government. The spark, remember, when you're doing context, you have to tell, okay, here's what happened before the time period specified. And remember, our time period that we're writing about is 1777 to 1800. The spark is what made that transition to happen. An example that I've been giving in class, and is, I think, a good one, is you would start out by explaining context using an example like, say, the French and Indian War, or the Stamp Act, or the violence that happened at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, where you would essentially say, prior to 1777, the United States did not exist. The colonists were looking to free themselves from the British government that they thought was very oppressive. So that's your context before 1777. The spark would be, an example would be the Declaration of Independence. Because we went from being colonists angered at our sovereign to the Declaration of Independence saying, okay, now we're a country, we're separating from Great Britain. That event, or that document, led us to the creation of the Articles of Confederation, because we were like, oh snap, we have a country now, but we need a government to govern that country. So that's an example of the spark that you might use for this essay. And again, you can use other examples out there. And I would imagine that a lot of you, since this is the first long essay, you might use that. And that's fine. I have no problem with that. I mean, because it's going to help you remember the content for the AP test. I'm all about it. That's fine. In your first 2 paragraphs, if you are arguing that Hamilton has a stronger link than Jefferson, you need to spend 2 paragraphs talking about those links and give specific pieces of historical information. And don't forget that you need to have a warrant for each one. A warrant which basically says, okay, here's my historical evidence. I'm explaining what it is. Remember, you have to assume the reader doesn't know what you're talking about. And the warrant says, basically, this is how this information proves my thesis. And then your last supporting paragraph would be to acknowledge the connection that Jefferson has with the Articles in the same fashion. In these middle paragraphs, you need, at the very least, 2 historical pieces of evidence per paragraph, and they need to be explained fully. You can't just name drop it to get the point. In your conclusion, you want to try and set the context after 1800. Okay, so what happened after 1800 in relation to, whether it be political parties, whether it be, the power of the federal government. And there's a number of things you could talk about here that are appropriate. You could talk about Jefferson's handling of the Louisiana Purchase. You could talk about, say, the court cases of the Marshall Court or the Marshall Court in general. All of those apply, but you remember, they have to be immediately after 1800. Anything is in play, I'd say, from 1800 to, say, 1820. Anything past that, that's reaching too far. And for you AP World folks, again, remember, historical synthesis in the conclusion is optional, where you connect to this period with something else going on in history. But it's a hard point to earn. Okay, the easier way is setting the context after the event. What happened next? Okay. The other type of essay that's very common with this prompt is the modify. All right, and this is where you're saying, okay, I see the connection of, say, Hamilton to the Constitution, but I don't see the connection between Jefferson and the Articles, or vice versa. So if you're going to take that modification where you're like, yeah, one of them fits, but the other one doesn't, you write your thesis statement first with the one that doesn't. So you'd say, although there are no clear links to Thomas Jefferson and the Articles of Confederation, comma, there are very strong links between Alexander Hamilton's viewpoint and the Constitution. Now, obviously, if you were doing the opposite, you would flip-flop it. You'd say, it is, while it might seem obvious that there are some connections to the Constitution and Hamilton's viewpoint, comma, it is very clear that Jefferson is connected to the Articles. And it's up to you guys how you want to approach it if you're doing this type of prompt. How you should set it up? Well, I'm going to give you an example. Same context, same spark, same with the conclusion. But I'm going to give you the example of, I think that Hamilton is linked to the Constitution. Okay? But I think that Jefferson is not linked to the Articles. So the way that I set it up is my first 2 paragraphs are going to explain, okay, yes, Hamilton's viewpoint is clearly seen in the Constitution. And here's 2 historical examples per paragraph, 4 total, that support that. My last supporting paragraph is where I'm going to say, okay, now while you might think that Jefferson has a clear connection to the Articles, I believe that's wrong, and here's why. Here's 2 pieces of historical evidence that will support that. And then, of course, you end with your conclusion, okay, and your context after 1800. So these are just 2 possible approaches. Now, if you are going to do the approach where you disagree with the prompt, and that is an option, that's totally fine. You want to set it up in the exact same way as if you agree with the prompt. So let's go back to that slide here for a second. So if this was a no, you would set it up the exact same way. All right. I will tell you, though, of the essays that I've read on this prompt, the ones that I typically see, because they're a little easier to argue, is either someone that supports it, supports the prompt, or modifies it. Now, if you are going to argue that there is no connection between the Articles and Jefferson, and no connection between the Constitution and Hamilton, you got to give me the specific historical evidence to back it up, and of course your argument too. Okay? All right, so let's get out of the full screen here. Let's check on the questions and see if there are any. Only one. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up the live stream right now. If you do have questions after I answer this first question, and only question, please see me tomorrow or on Wednesday in class. I'd be happy to answer them. If you want to go ahead and type them on the Google Doc, I'll be sure to check it out before class tomorrow or later tomorrow evening. And certainly if you have questions, you can type them now. There's no problem with that. So I'm going to go ahead and answer the first one. This question says, was the Sedition Act ever challenged as being unconstitutional? The answer is no. Now, it was challenged by members of Congress as being unconstitutional and the general public as being unconstitutional, but no action was taken. And the reason why is very simple. The Supreme Court did not have that power until 1803. Now, had this happened in 1803 or 1804, you can bet that the Supreme Court likely would have been presented with a court case that might challenge the constitutionality of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So I hope that answers your question, whoever wrote that. All right, so since this is live, I am going to give you guys about 5 minutes to type any other questions that you might have, and then I'll answer those, and then we'll wrap things up. So I'll throw on some good Irish music here, and then I will answer any questions that you have. We'll have 5 minutes, okay? All right, so 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap things up. Any more questions? Go ahead and let me know. Oh, Ben, excellent question. Well done, sir. That's an excellent question. Okay, so we're going to have 5 minutes for you to type any questions that you have, and then otherwise we'll wrap things up. All right, here we go. Okay, 2 more minutes, guys. Any questions you may have? 2 more minutes. Go ahead and type them on that Google Doc. All right, everybody. So let's see what we got here for questions. Oh, I like that image. Whoever posted that, well done. It's very cool. Hopefully we can answer all those questions that you guys have about America over the course of the year. If my eyes don't deceive me, that looks like some question marks ahead above everyone's head. So that's the goal. Learn American history as much as we can between now and the end of the year. All right, so we got another question. For the introductory thesis statement, should we include a counter-argument with phrases like although, despite, or however? Well, I would say this. The only time you're really going to include a counter-argument in this particular prompt is if you are doing a modified argument. So the counter-argument would be something like this that says, like, okay, well, yeah, we don't really see Jefferson in the articles, but we do see him there in this sense. If you're going to provide that, I could see that being the case in the supporting paragraph, but the way this prompt is set up, the counter-argument is something that you can certainly explore within the supporting paragraphs, whether it's yes or modify. I don't think in this particular area, because it's our first, and I tried to keep the essay, the first one is very, very, very simple. We're actually going to talk about where you can put in the counter-argument for our next unit essay, oddly enough. So where you can acknowledge it in the conclusion. You can acknowledge it in the introduction as you help set the context after you've done the before context. Or you can mention the counter-argument in the body portion of your essay. It's a great question. All right. So Mason's got a question. How did Sacagawea find Lewis and Clark on their expedition? Well, she was married to a French trapper who accompanied Lewis and Clark on the expedition, and oddly enough, she had a baby with her. So I mean, how hardcore is that? Like, she's basically walking with all of these guys in the military, and these volunteer, they're hunters, and craftsmen, and all sorts of these very specialized folks, and she's carrying a baby with her husband. So that's how she ended up on the expedition. Is that her husband, a French trapper, was on the expedition. And thank you. I believe that was Mary for the Sacagawea SP. No worry, Mason. It's a very hard name to spell. All right. Looks like we got another question, and I'll wait. Go ahead. It's okay to type it. Thanks, Mary. Excellent. All right. Did Washington have any bias towards Jefferson or Hamilton? Yes, he did. It's hard, though, because Washington and Jefferson were Virginians, and in fact, both Washington and Jefferson were chosen by Virginia to represent the colony at the Constitutional Convention. Or no, not the Constitutional Convention, sorry, the Continental Congress that ended up adopting the Declaration of Independence. So they obviously had a very long relationship. However, Alexander Hamilton was a young officer on Washington's staff. He was George Washington's personal secretary. And he was very close to George Washington throughout his presidency and after. So if I had to pick who he was more biased towards, I think he might have a little more bias towards Alexander Hamilton because to a certain extent he was kind of a protege, whereas Jefferson was more of a contemporary. So I'd say if I had to pick, it's probably a little more Hamilton than Jefferson. But I can say this, he really loved John Adams, which Thomas Jefferson did as well. Alexander Hamilton didn't like John Adams, but we all know how Alexander Hamilton's personality can be a little touchy. Great question. All right, so what do we got here? What did the Federalists do to make everyone mad? Okay, mad during the era of good feelings. So Nadine, the answer to that is the Hartford Convention. So the Hartford Convention was a meeting that they had because they were very dissatisfied with the War of 1812. They were all New England merchants for the most part. They didn't like the idea their trade with England had been interrupted, which meant their pocketbooks had been interrupted. They also didn't like the idea they'd been under Democratic-Republican president for almost 16 years, with Jefferson and Madison. So they wanted some changes to the Constitution. So they met in Hartford and they came up with their list of changes. But when they published it, it was published at the time of a great national celebration, and that's the victory at the Battle of New Orleans that ended the War of 1812. Or that, I should say, didn't end the War of 1812, was the last battle fought in the War of 1812, which, helped Andrew Jackson rise to prominence. So the Hartford Convention, basically, when they issued their results, it was at a time of over celebration and patriotism, and it made them look weak and whiny. And what ended up happening is most of them got voted out of office in the next election. So that's what the Hartford Convention did. All right, what other questions do we have here? All right. How accurate is the musical's portrayal of Alexander Hamilton? I'll tell you something about Hamilton. I was lucky enough to see it in San Francisco with some of my history peeps. It was, first off, what an amazing musical. Big fan of musicals, by the way. At least good ones. Also, low-key great musical, 1776. If you want to hear John Adams and Thomas Jefferson sing at each other, it's outstanding. But in terms of Hamilton the guy, I think they portrayed Jefferson a little too mean and Hamilton a little too nice. That's just my take on it. But there's a lot of great little factoids that they put in there that are very accurate. For example, there's a song, I believe, on the Hamilton soundtrack called "The World Turned Upside Down." Now that actually, oddly enough, was the title of the song that was played by the British Army after they were defeated by Washington at Yorktown, because they're like, okay, everything's backwards now. How could this have happened to us? So there are little really beautiful historical nuggets in the musical. But as far as how accurate that is to Hamilton, I think it's a little more forgiving of his very brash personality. And do you have a favorite period of class? Yes, all of them. I love all my AP U.S. history classes. I love my Avid class. I love being at Sonoma Valley High. I'm a Sonoma Valley High alumni. So, hey, love to you all. All right. And I know that's totally a dodge, but oh well. You'll just have to believe me. And it's true. I don't have a favorite class. You guys are all great. I got the best job in the world. I get to work with people like all of you. So, remember, for those of you in first, third, or fifth period, you're going to see me. Well, you could come see me tomorrow. You're definitely going to see me on Wednesday. So shoot any questions my way. Come by and see me if you want to talk about the essay or the multiple choice. And I hope this study session was a help. So don't stay up too late tonight. Remember, you don't have any chapter notes to do for my class. So make sure we all go to bed at a reasonable time. Because I sure as heck I'm going to go to bed soon. Maybe 2 hours after I finish doing a little grading. Anyway, I hope all of you have a wonderful evening. And as always, may the force be with all of you. All right. Good night, everybody.